Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Closing Backup and Recovery Gaps, Limit Your Customers' Exposure to IT Risk. I'm Amber Noble, a marketing specialist at Barracuda MSP, and I'm happy to be moderating today's session. Today I'm joined by Kyle Marsan, a systems engineer here at Barracuda MSP. During today's educational webinar, Kyle will take us through an inside perspective of backup services. He'll share attitudes and approaches modern IT professionals have when it comes to backing up and recovering data. Before we get started, let's do some brief housekeeping. During the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to share them using the questions or chat panel to the right of the Zoom webinar screen. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief polling survey. Please take a moment to tell us what you think so that we can continually improve the content and quality of our online events. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Kyle to begin today's presentation. Take it away, Kyle.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks for everyone joining us today. So today I'm going to be hoping go ahead and talk about a recent survey that Barracuda ran. It's part of this year's World Backup Day. And as part of that, we're going to go ahead and look at some of the more interesting survey results and kind of just take a look at some of the overall threats that companies are facing today and some ways to go ahead and try to limit those threats. So I want to start off by talking about the current state of data and how that's affecting organizations. So as you all know, the major issues that MSPs and companies face is knowing that not only are you responsible for protecting your own data, but your customers also put the protection of their data in your hands as well. So failure to protect these assets can cost you reputation, customers, in some more extreme cases, even your business. So overall, data is growing at an exponential rate. We're seeing annual data creation of over 175 zettabytes, which is predicted by 2023. I had to go ahead and look up what that is, and that's a whole heck of a lot of data. 90% of all the data that's ever been created in the world has actually been created in the past 2 years. So let that one sink in. And this is going to ahead and result in valuable data, but it also creates problems such as limitations of customer infrastructure, but also the biggest question, how are you going to be able to manage and secure all of this data? And then, of course, with all of that data comes risk, right? So what can you do to go ahead and try to overcome risk? So the first thing is to try to go ahead and understand trends. So learn about experience within the industry from your peers and try to find all of the experience to go ahead and mitigate your own risks to start. Some of the trends that are previously being experienced were just experienced by large companies, but now we're seeing that even small companies, single employee companies are open to risk, and I'm sure you guys manage companies of all sizes. So just to look at an example, in terms of just ransomware, it used to be the case that the people who were the bad actors were primarily targeting large enterprises, but we've been noticing a movement where they're now targeting smaller companies. These attacks have lower rewards for the cyber criminals, but they tend to have a better hit rate, and that's basically because of limitations imposed on small companies that they have in terms of dealing with ransomware threats. So even though each payoff may be lower from the small companies than they are from enterprise, the higher rate of success and the lower amount of overall work that's put into an attack makes it just as profitable. So these are the types of things that you guys really need to be looking at. And then there's also things like data loss due to human error, for example, from someone who was trying to save a file but ended up deleting it or didn't realize they needed it, deleted it, and it's gone from there. So all these problems become worse when you consider that a majority of the respondents that we talked to as part of this survey are responsible for backing up multiple sites. So not only do they have the problem of exponential data growth, but now that's across multiple customers, multiple locations. So even though the survey results responded that just 42% are backing up one site, if you add up all of the other respondents, you realize that there's a whole lot of data that needs to be managed. So it's really important that a backup solution is very easy to use. That becomes one of the more important aspects. And also scalability is becoming crucial. So you need to have a product that's going to be good not only for what is currently sitting in the customer environment, but plan for the next year, the next 5 years, because as we've seen, the rate of data growth has just become explosive. So as part of the global survey, we ended up surveying over 1,000 IT professionals across all different kinds of industries. I'm going to talk about some of the commonalities, what I found surprising, and some best practices that you can put in place to try to protect the data. So one of the trends that we've been seeing is that people are protecting more of their environment. So where people used to just back up the business critical data and that was kind of it, as the additional data expansion has accelerated, we're finding that people need to back up even more of what they have, or more data has become even more important. So that means not only you need a backup solution that can handle all different types of data sources. So for this particular question, people were able to select more than one option. What I found interesting here is that they were aware that they need to be able to protect a lot of their data instead of just focusing on the most critical data. And then at the bottom, we saw a very low number protecting SaaS data. And we think that's due to people who are relying on the actual vendors that are applying the cloud applications themselves, rather than relying on themselves to perform the backup. So I'll talk a little bit about this and the risks of relying on just the vendor later on. So what are some tips for finding the right backup solution? I'd say the first tip is it's really important to plan ahead. So when you're thinking about backup and disaster recovery solutions, you don't just want to picture your own environment and what it looks like today or even 6 months from now. Think of what it's going to look like in a couple of years, 1 to 3 years out. Even in some cases, you may need to think longer than that and think about things like, what technology will I be using? Where is the data going to live? Am I going to migrate any of the customer's data to Office 365? Am I going to migrate it to other public cloud, Azure, AWS? So getting a long-term plan of the customer's business needs and developing a strategy on things that you're going to be using within the environment where the data is going to be stored is becoming vital. The next thing is you're going to want to look for a solution that offers the widest range of protection for all of these different things that you've developed in your plan. So being able to protect data in Office 365, being able to protect data in public cloud. Maybe you've decided to go with something like a hyper-converged backup solution. These are all things to keep in mind. And these are all things to think about and to evaluate when you're looking for a solution. So something that can offer protection across a number of different operating systems and applications across the customer environment. Another tip I'll suggest is to go ahead and choose the best deployment model that fits you and your environment. So whether this is something like a purpose-built backup appliance that's designed to be easy to deploy, provides everything you need to create data and backup, or maybe you just need something that's software-based, that's flexible, that's easy to go ahead and deploy. It allows you to go through and plan and have options. And then the biggest thing here is it's not just important to choose a model based strictly on price. I know that companies are price sensitive, everybody wants the best deal, but there's always going to be budget restraints. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen in this whole space is that somebody went with a solution because it was the cheapest option, instead of picking the one that best fit their needs, their goals, their environment. So, you don't want to be spending a lot of time managing multiple different interfaces or managing multiple different solutions from providers. So it's important that you go ahead and you look for something that lets you deploy and configure backups, and most importantly, manage all of those from a single interface. So no matter where you are, you'll always have access to your customer backup, have the ability to just log into a web portal, perform a restore at the click of a button. So nice and easy, that's key. And then finally, along those same lines, ease of use is very important. So backup and recovery doesn't have to be complex. We all have a bunch of different tasks that we're responsible for, a bunch of different customer needs and fires that we have to put out. And there's very few IT professionals that are focused just strictly on backup and recovery. So having something that's easy to learn, easy to use, easy to train others, train your techs is a vital need. So in another part of the survey that we sent out, we asked people if they're migrating their applications or email services to public cloud. We asked this because people are talking about how cloud is everything, and we were just curious to find out if our respondents have run into that as well. And cloud migration strategies seem to vary based on the type of organization, But one interesting thing is that if you add up all of the people who plan on migrating, it ends up being about half of all respondents. The other half of people actually have no plans to migrate to the cloud, which I found just as interesting. So the respondents seem to think that the applications aren't as important as other things like email services. When we asked the question, it was mixed, but only 31% had no plans to migrate any data. 33% of respondents' migrations were already complete, and the rest of the respondents were planning to move their email services to the cloud within the next few years. So overall, we discovered that 63% of people are backing up their data to the cloud, 36% are not. So it's not only risky, but you're also not going to follow industry best practices when you keep all of the data local. It's becoming very, very crucial, very important that you get a secondary offsite copy of all backed up data. And at Barracuda, we like to follow the golden rule here of backup, which we call 3-2-1. So number one, have at least 3 copies of your data, specifically having your single production copy, and then at least 2 backup copies of your data. In case there's any kind of failure, whether you're losing a single file or an entire server, you can recover from that failure regardless. The second is to have at least 2 different types of storage. So for example, this could be something like direct storage. Maybe you're using a SAN within the environment connecting to your servers, and then you're looking at what can you use for backup storage. So obviously something that sits outside of the production data. Are you going to have a copy to tape? Maybe you're going to have a copy in the cloud, and you want to separate segregated backup with storage as well. And then lastly, and probably the most important one, is you want to have at least 1 offsite copy of your data. So if something happens to a single server, you're protected, you have 3 copies of your data, but you'll also want to be protected across different kinds of storage so that nothing happens. And then if something more extreme happens, an entire site goes down, well, now you have the data stored safely at some alternate location that you can go ahead and ensure that you can restore back from. So in our research, what we've seen, what I've seen personally, is that Office 365 has been dominant in the market. 62% of all businesses are currently on Office 365, and Microsoft's saying that it's growing 55% year over year. And the users are not just using email anymore. So when most people think about Office 365, they tend to equate it with email, but Microsoft has much, much more available in terms of business applications at this point. And then one of the things we found is that there's a whole bunch of different applications that customers want to protect within Office 365. So as you can see, the #1 application is Exchange, it is email, but we're seeing increasing numbers of OneDrive and SharePoint usage, and things all the way down to applications like Planner or Dynamics. So one aspect that's very crucial about this is that people are relying more and more on SaaS type solutions and applications like Office 365, and it's important to know that all of these applications still need to be protected. So right now with Exchange, you can get into a situation where people may not be able to retrieve everything they need if they're relying just on Microsoft's default policies for attention. So oftentimes this can be very limited retention. So what you really want to be able to do, and this goes back to the planning, you want to be able to help protect customers if they accidentally delete something, move something, don't realize they need it back, but at some point in time outside of retention, they need it back. So as you can see from these numbers, email is definitely a big portion of what customers care to protect, but OneDrive and SharePoint are vastly growing. So what happens there is that the driving force of email is what actually moves customers to Office 365. And then companies realize all of the other things that are available from Microsoft. So, it doesn't just stop at email. So they figured that they had to move things like file servers onto OneDrive. Then they saw that they had to move their SharePoint on-prem environment into the cloud as well, naturally to SharePoint in Office 365. And as you can see, there's some early adopters in the space that are starting to show interest in consolidating overall usage with things like Planner. To go ahead and use that as their task management, or Dynamics to go ahead and boost their CRM solution. And we're starting to see a lot of very crucial data to the business outside of email. So it's a very important opportunity for IT admins to take a step back, look at this landscape, view the environment, look at the opportunities, and make sure that all of these are considered as part of your data protection strategy. Because after all of this data is becoming very important. So another question we went ahead and asked respondents is what solutions are customers using specifically to back up Office 365? So a lot of people are using third-party backup software, but alarmingly almost 40% are not. So almost 40% of the respondents are relying strictly on Microsoft to be able to provide all of the backup for the data. And that's a huge risk because you might not be able to get the level of granularity you want within the information that you want to retrieve, or even have access to the data for the period of time that you would expect. So a common misconception I see in talking with partners is that Microsoft has redundancy built into Office 365, which is true from their server level, right? If they lose a server, odds are the customer's never going to notice. But the question that I like to ask is, what happens if somebody deletes a file? Does Microsoft care about that? So for example, in the case of SharePoint or OneDrive, it's really easy to get into a situation where you may need to retrieve something that someone's deleted. And then in this case, you have to restore the entire environment, or you have to open up a ticket with Microsoft to open up a support case, either of which is not a really great idea if you're using Office 365, especially if it's, as we've seen, such a crucial part of everybody's business now. And then lastly, I want to go ahead and cover the key reasons that your customers need to actually go ahead and protect the data within Office 365. So what are the most common causes for data loss within your customer's organization? I think at this point, most people seem to recognize that user error, deleting data, moving it and forgetting where you put it, these are all the main causes, main problems based around Office 365 data. So I want to go ahead and build off of that topic and discuss options that we've seen about the key reasons customers go ahead and lose data in Office 365 specifically. So the biggest culprit becomes that delete button. Most data loss that happens is usually caused by employees erroneously deleting a file. Somebody's trying to clean up their system, reduce the size of their mailbox or exchange, and they end up deleting data afterwards. Office 365 is not a viable backup solution for this reason, and I'll go ahead and talk about this a little bit later. But the next point that I wanted to talk about is compliance. So we've seen an increase in the amount of data regulations, retrieval requirements, especially with the movement of all of the data to the cloud. It's really important to understand that this is another reason why you need to consider a data protection strategy for your SaaS-based data. So Microsoft offers a couple retention policies, but they can become pretty complex. So oftentimes they have a pretty steep learning curve to get used to, while the requirements themselves may be pretty simple. In most cases, you need a secondary copy of backup data that you can access easily. You don't need to worry about it. You don't need to think about it. So when you are thinking about moving documents to Office 365, or if you've already done that, consider compliance requirements that your customers have to follow when you're developing your backup plan. And then the last key reason why you need to have a backup solution is that right now there's a lot of data sovereignty laws and regulations on the rise. So there's a big movement to understand who owns what data, who's responsible for what data. And I think it's pretty basic to understand that your data that is stored in Office 365 is still your data. You own it, you should be able to control it. Office 365 in most cases takes responsibility in making sure that their services are up and that the uptimes are up with their service level agreements that you sign with them, and that the applications are always online. However, that doesn't mean that the data you want is backed up the way that your customers need it, or that it's available when they need it. So you want to make sure that you have a solution in mind that lets you control that decision. It lets you know how long you're storing the data copies for. It lets you know how you can handle it in case a disaster happens, and how you can best help a customer recover from that disaster. So why is Office 365 data protection not good enough? For this question, I'm only going to talk about the top 3 services that we saw: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. So first of all, especially in terms of Exchange, the recycle bin is not a backup, which is what Microsoft offers. Office 365 offers a recycle bin. It allows data to be stored there for a specific period of time until it's automatically deleted. So that's to allow if somebody mistakenly deletes a file, or an email, they can go back to it, recover it. But once that time limit passes, it's really difficult to go ahead, sometimes I've heard even impossible to get that data back. So, when you do need to get the data back, there's certain retention locks Microsoft offers to keep the data for longer, but they can oftentimes be pretty hard to understand. So, even then the options are limited to put it back into the exact mailbox versus getting it directly to the user. You need something that's a little bit more flexible than that. It goes past putting it, back to the original location, but giving you flexibility to be able to put the data where you want it, send it to another user, whatever the case may be. And then another big gap there is that if a user deletes something, their data is only there across the platforms for about 30 days. Once that 30 days passes, it's gone. What Office 365 offers users is the ability to recover from slight mistakes. It's not a data protection strategy. It's not going to, cover throughout the years. It's 30 days. So it's really helpful to have something that goes ahead and protects data for as long as you need it, for as long as the customer needs it. It lets you define how long data is kept. You're not, limited to these 14 to 30 days with SharePoint. You're not limited to only retrieving individual files. You don't have to talk to support to retrieve it. It's your data. You own it. You manage it. You should have access to it. So for some best practices around Office 365, first and foremost, I think we're going to want a daily copy of the Office 365 data. So that guarantees if anything happens, you're only losing up to a day's worth of work. Usually it's less than that, but it's important that you have at least a daily copy. The next point is that I think it's extremely important to highlight that, that what you'll need is to have unlimited storage and unlimited retention for your backup. So you need to choose a solution that offers you these flexible options to make sure that data is available for years. Because when you go ahead and make a decision to move to Office 365 or the cloud, you're probably part of a 5 or 10-year plan with that decision. You need to make sure that your data protection strategy covers you throughout that time period. The cost of storing backed up data in Office 365 can also be pretty high. So, it makes sense to go with an alternate solution for that need. So make sure the solution you're implementing has unlimited storage so you can control the data and keep it for as long as you need. And then the third point here is that it has to be accessible fast. It has to be easy to use. Office 365 takes the hassle away from managing software to make life a lot easier for users and admins. And I think a backup solution should offer the exact same thing. So it shouldn't be something that you spend hours and hours on implementing. It shouldn't be something that you spend hours maintaining. It should be something that you go ahead, plug into the environment, and right away it's going to start backing up and protecting the data while still allowing you as access to how long the data is kept, things like that. And when it comes to restoring, something that should only be a few clicks of a button, it should give you exactly what you want when you want it. Ease of use is really important because as we've seen, people have many different daily activities they have to take care of. So adding in one that takes more than half an hour or even an hour and stripping that down to a couple of minutes can go ahead and really be helpful in the future. And then the last point is that we need to have point-in-time recovery. So I can't stress that point enough. Point-in-time recovery means that you can identify any period of time before some incident happened. You can click on it, and you can go ahead and restore from that exact instance. So a backup solution that does this needs to be able to go ahead and restore data from before an incident occurred. So it's really helpful in cases like mass deletion of data, or I've seen situations where OneDrive accounts have been hit by malware. You need something that goes ahead, it covers multiple files, folders, users, and it's not going to take weeks of your time to go ahead and manage it. So whenever you're looking for a third-party service or for a backup solution, make sure that it offers point-in-time recovery. So for these reasons, it's important to rely on third-party services because, as we mentioned, Office 365 alone isn't enough when it comes to backup and data recovery. So when you're protecting data, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, you really need to select a partner that's going to be able to handle the data types, no matter where the source resides, no matter where the data lives, what type of data it is. So, why should you consider using Barracuda MSP? Barracuda MSP is able to provide this protection both on-prem and in the cloud. we offer backup that's consumable. Our products are easy to use, so if you're managing for multiple different sites, multiple customers, it's not a problem because you have a solution that's ready to go. They're scalable. With us, there's unlimited retention, storage, cloud backup. It allows us to go ahead and provide that golden rule, 3-2-1. So all the things that we were talking about in terms of best practices sort of fit very nicely with what we've heard from the survey and major concerns we've heard from partners when it goes ahead and based around selecting a backup and recovery tool. So no matter what type of backup and recovery situation you get in, I'd really recommend looking at the different options Barracuda has available. So thank you guys for joining us today. I'll kick it back over to Amber.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm just going to go ahead and launch that poll I had mentioned at the beginning. If everyone could take a quick minute and just answer the questions for us to help us improve our webinars going forward. And while that's going on in the background, if anyone has any questions that Kyle did not get to, go ahead and pop them in the questions or chat panel, and he'll take a moment right now to answer some of those. I'm getting a few questions for today's webinar. It has been recorded, and we can send out a copy of the recording in the following day or so.
So one of the questions is specifically around the Intronis backup product. Is that stored somewhere in the cloud? Yes, that'll be the Barracuda cloud. So all of these products are based on an annual agreement that are billed monthly. So an interesting question, as some of you guys may or may not know, Barracuda has acquired an RMM, Managed Workplace, from Avast. The question is Barracuda going to revamp the RMM tool now that they've acquired it? I hope so. There's a lot of talks in place now about all the different integrations and things like that. So I'm very hopeful and excited for what the RMM is going to look like in the future. For anyone that's interested in seeing a demo of any of these, please reach out, contact the sales team, and they can certainly get myself or anyone from my team available to run you through a product and through a portal demo. So any customers, anyone that was with Intronis prior to Barracuda is now a Barracuda MSP partner. So I definitely recommend reaching out to your sales team, and they can go over all the different things that we offer now. Back to the RMM, how far in the future? I don't have any timelines on that I can mention. I know that it is super high priority. It's stuff that they're actively working on. I'm just not privy to that information yet either. Is Barracuda integrated with any other RMMs? So the Intronis backup product specifically has some aspects of deployment and monitoring that are available with other RMMs. There's some PSA integration on that side too. So specifically ConnectWise and AutoTask, we can do things like ticketing to your service board or updating invoices on the billing side.
Okay, well, I think we answered all the questions. If we didn't, if we missed one, because they all kind of just come in at once, I do have a log of the questions asked, and we'll make sure to get back to you. Thank you again, Kyle, for joining us today. It was a pleasure. We hope to talk to everybody again. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, guys.